My father threw me out and called me a disgrace for being pregnant. At 18, but now that my daughter's father turned out to be a billionaire heir, he wants to be grandfather of the year. My father gave me 2 hours. 2 hours to pack 18 years of my life into whatever I could carry. Rain was coming down hard against my bedroom window that night. The kind of October rain that turns the driveway lights into blurred smears of yellow. And I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should grab an umbrella, as if an umbrella was going to matter for what came next. I stood in my bedroom doorway and watched him check his watch like I was a contractor running late on a bid. "You have until 9, he said. I'd start now. I was 18 years old, 11 weeks pregnant, and shaking so hard my teeth clicked together. My father, Walter Calder, stood in the hallway of the house I grew up in wearing his church clothes because it was a Wednesday, and Wednesday meant elders meeting, and even me, had not been allowed to disrupt his schedule. "Dad, please just let me explain." "There's nothing to explain, Ava." He said my name like it cost him something. "You're a disgrace." He didn't shout it. That was the worst part. He said it low and flat, like a man reading a diagnosis off a chart, like the word had been sitting loaded in his mouth for weeks, and he'd only been waiting for a reason to fire it. Disgrace. He let it hang there. Then he said it again, quieter, like he wanted to make sure it landed twice. Behind him, out the window, I watched a white pickup truck pull into our circular driveway. A man in a company polo got out with a toolbox. "Is that the locksmith?" I asked. "Dad, did you already call a locksmith?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The truck in the driveway answered for him. He had made his decision before I ever opened my mouth to tell him. The conversation in the hallway wasn't a conversation at all. It was a formality, a courtesy he was extending to himself, so that later, if anyone asked, he could say he'd given me a chance to speak. I packed a duffel bag with clothes that didn't fit right anymore. I took my mother's rosary off my nightstand, the only thing of hers he'd let me keep. I took $40 from an envelope I'd been saving since junior year. My father stood in the doorway the entire time, arms crossed, watching me the way you'd watch a stranger pack up a rental unit you needed back by 5. When I walked past him with my bag, he didn't move to hug me. He didn't cry. He just said one more thing, so quiet I almost missed it under the sound of the locksmith's drill already grinding into the front deadbolt. "Don't call this house again." Then he closed the door. I stood on the porch of the only home I'd ever known and listened to a stranger install a lock that would never again open for me, while inside, my father walked back toward the kitchen to finish reheating whatever he'd been eating before I interrupted his evening. I was 18. I had $11 less than my 40 because I'd already spent some on a bus fare I hadn't used yet. I had a duffel bag, a rosary, and a positive pregnancy test still folded into my coat pocket, like a piece of evidence I hadn't figured out what to do with. I stood on that porch until the porch light shut off on a timer, and then I walked to the end of the driveway and sat down on the curb because I genuinely did not know where else to go. That was the night my life split into a before and an after. I didn't understand yet how far the after would stretch, or how long it would take before anyone with my last name looked at me again without doing the math on what I was worth to them first. To understand that night, you have to understand my father 4 years earlier, standing in a different doorway, in a hospital room, holding my mother's hand while a machine beeped out the last of her heart rate. My mother's name was Renata. She died of ovarian cancer 9 days after my 14th birthday, in a hospital 40 minutes from our house, with my father's hand wrapped so tightly around hers that the nurse had to pry his fingers loose afterward. I remember that detail more than almost anything else from that week, the prying. Like, even in grief, my father couldn't let go of something without someone forcing him. My mother had been the only person in our house who made room for softness. She kept fresh flowers on the kitchen table even when the budget was tight that month. She let me stay up late on Fridays to watch old movies with her, the two of us sharing a bowl of popcorn while my father worked late at the brokerage. She used to say that my father loved us the way he balanced his books, carefully, cautiously, always checking the columns twice, and that someday, if we were patient, the softer parts of him would come out from under all that caution. I believed her. I don't think I believe that anymore. After she died, my father didn't grieve so much as he restructured. He treated the house like a company that had just lost its most valuable asset and needed a turnaround plan. Dinner at 6, sharp, church every Sunday, front pew, second seat from the aisle, because that was where we'd always sat as a family of 4, and he refused to change the seating even down to 3. Grades above 90%, no exceptions, because a Calder daughter did not bring home anything that could be misread by anyone doing the math on our family's worth. Image became the only language he spoke fluently. He ran Calder and Whitmore Insurance out of a glass office on Route 9 in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, and he ran our house the same way he ran his client files. Everything labeled, everything defensible, nothing left exposed to liability. My brother, Theo, was 3 years younger than me, and he adapted the way kids do, by getting small and quiet and agreeable. I adapted by finding cracks in the system and slipping through them when I could. That instinct is, I think, what eventually got me pregnant at 17 and disowned at 18, but it's also, I've come to believe, the same instinct that kept me alive for the 5 years after. There was an earlier incident, when I was 16, that I didn't understand the shape of until years later. I'd started seeing a boy named Marcus from my chemistry class, nothing serious, holding hands at lunch, a few phone calls after homework. My father found out and said nothing to me directly. Instead, 2 weeks later, at a Rotary Club dinner, he cornered Marcus's father and mentioned, casually, over drinks, that he'd had someone look into a few things regarding Marcus's Marcus's family. A repossessed car 2 years back, a great-uncle's DUI, a bankruptcy filing from when Marcus's mother was in her 20s. He framed it as concern. Due diligence, he called it. The same phrase he used when he vetted new hires at the brokerage. Marcus's father was humiliated. Marcus stopped talking to me within the week, too embarrassed to explain why. My father never once discussed it with me. He simply solved a problem he considered his to solve, using information he'd quietly gathered without telling anyone he was gathering it, and then acted like nothing had happened. I didn't think about that night again for years, but I want you to remember it, because it matters later. My father investigates people. That's not a metaphor. That's a documented habit, going back at least to when I was 16 years old. 2 years after Marcus, I met a boy named Henrik at a house party near my dorm at Grantham University, where I'd started my freshman year that fall. He was a foreign exchange student, tall, quiet, with an accent I couldn't place beyond somewhere Scandinavian, in the country for one semester through some business program. We spent one night together in late September. In the morning, he was gone before I woke up. No number, no last name that I ever caught clearly. Just a first name that may or may not have even been real, which it would turn out years later, it wasn't. 6 weeks after that, I sat on the edge of a dorm bathtub holding a plastic stick with 2 pink lines on it, and I understood, with a kind of cold clarity, that I had absolutely no way to find him again, and that I was going to have to figure out what came next entirely on my own. I told my father in November, 3 weeks before that night on the porch. I'd hoped foolishly that the distance would soften the blow, that he'd have time to adjust to the idea before I came home for Thanksgiving. I called him from the stairwell of my dorm building because the reception was better there than in my room, sitting on the cold concrete step with my knees pulled up to my chest, rehearsing the sentence in my head for almost 20 minutes before I actually said it out loud. Dad, I'm pregnant. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I asked if he was still there. When he finally spoke, his voice was terrifyingly calm, the voice he used with difficult clients, the one that meant he'd already stopped listening to explanations and started drafting terms. How far along? 8 weeks. And the father? He's not in the picture. He was an exchange student. He's gone, Dad. I don't even have a way to reach him. Another silence. I could hear him breathing, slow and controlled, the way he breathed when he was working through numbers that weren't adding up the way he wanted them to. I need some time to think, he said finally. Don't tell your brother yet. I'll call you. He didn't call. Not that week, not the next. I drove home for Thanksgiving anyway, because some naive part of me believed that seeing my face, seeing that I was still his daughter and not just a sentence he'd been chewing on for 3 weeks, might soften whatever he'd been deciding. I unpacked my bag in my childhood bedroom on a Wednesday evening, and I was folding a sweater into the dresser drawer when I heard him come up the stairs behind me, still in his church clothes, and stop in the doorway. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't ask if I was scared, or if I'd seen a doctor, or if I had a plan. He asked me instead whether I understood what a pregnant, unmarried, 18-year-old daughter would do to how people at Calder and Whitmore looked at him, whether I understood what it would do to his standing at church, to Theo's reputation walking the halls of the same high school I'd graduated from 3 years earlier. I remember standing there with a folded sweater still in my hands, understanding with a kind of vertigo that in 3 weeks of silence, he'd run every calculation except the one where I still mattered to him as a person, rather than a variable in someone else's spreadsheet. I'm still your daughter, I said. He didn't answer that. He just looked at me for a long moment, said he needed a few more days, and went back downstairs to finish his coffee like nothing had happened. 3 days later, on a Wednesday, he called a locksmith before he'd even told me he'd made up his mind. My daughter, Mila, was born the following June, in a hospital room with no father listed on the birth certificate and no family in the waiting room. A nurse named Patrice held my hand through the last hour of labor because I had genuinely no one else there. And when Mila finally came out crying, Patrice was the one who cried with me, a stranger who happened to be kind on the one night I most needed a stranger to be kind. The 5 years after that were the hardest of my life, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise or dress them up as some noble struggle, because most days they just felt like survival with no dignity attached to it at all. I dropped out of Grantham that winter. I spent 4 months in a women's shelter on the east side of Millbrook, a converted motel with thin walls and a shared kitchen where I learned to keep my food in a bag with my name written on it in Sharpie, because otherwise it disappeared. Mila slept in a dresser drawer lined with a folded towel for the first 2 months of her life, because a crib was $60 I didn't have and a car seat wasn't optional. I remember counting quarters on the shelter's laundry room floor to see if I had enough for a single load of Mila's onesies. I got a job waiting tables at Harlow's Diner on Route 9, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a pie case by the register, and I learned fast that the smile was part of the wage. Men twice my age would grab my wrist to get my attention for a refill and leave $2 on a check that ran close to $40. I walked to the 5 a.m. shift because the first bus didn't run until 6:15, 3 miles in the dark in whatever coat I owned that year, because Millbrook's winters don't wait for your budget to catch up. Some weeks I ate plain rice for dinner 3 nights running so that Mila could have the eggs, the real butter, the whole milk instead of the diluted kind. My father lived 20 minutes away that entire time, in the 5-bedroom house on Brambleworth Lane where I'd grown up, with the circular driveway and the lawn service that came every Thursday whether the grass needed it or not. As far as I ever learned, he told people at church and at the brokerage a story about a daughter who'd gone off the rails, who was somewhere out west, doing God knows what. what? One version of the story that made its way back to me through a cousin had me working in Las Vegas. He never once corrected it. It was, I think, easier for him to explain a daughter who'd chosen chaos than a daughter he'd personally locked out of a house over an accident of biology neither of us controlled. My brother Theo was the only one who ever came. He was 15 when I left, still living under my father's roof and my father's tuition promises, and he was terrified, genuinely terrified, that if our father found out he was seeing me, the money for his own future would disappear the same way mine had. He came anyway. He'd meet me at Kessler Park on Saturday afternoons, always with a story ready in case anyone asked where he'd been, and he'd bring whatever he could manage. A grocery bag of clothes from the thrift store on 5th, $40 folded into an envelope, once an entire box of diapers he'd bought with his own after-school job money and hidden in his trunk for 2 weeks before he found a Saturday to deliver them. He never once told me it would be okay. He just kept showing up, which, from a Calder, was its own kind of miracle. I clawed my way up an inch at a time over those 5 years. I got my GED studying on a diner's guest Wi-Fi at 2 in the morning after closing shift, my laptop propped on a stack of ketchup bottles. I enrolled part-time at the community college 2 towns over, 2 classes a semester, whatever I could afford after rent and formula. I moved from Harlow's to a better restaurant with steadier tips, then picked up a second job doing weekend billing for a dentist's office, once I'd learned enough bookkeeping to fake competence until I earned the real thing. Mila, through all of it, turned out to be sharp in a way that made the hard years feel almost bearable. She was reading full sentences by 4. She was doing basic addition before she ever set foot in a kindergarten classroom. Every missed meal, every double shift, every night I sat up doing algebra homework with a 5-year-old asleep on my shoulder, I told myself it was for her, and mostly, I believed it. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. I made my peace with my father's absence, somewhere in year 3. Not forgiveness, peace. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring. I stopped composing the speech I'd give him if he ever showed up. I built a small, tight, exhausting life that didn't have room in it for a man who'd changed his locks before he'd finished saying the word disgrace. And for 2 years, that life held steady, right up until the day a stranger in an expensive coat sat down in my section at Harlow's Diner and asked if I'd gone to Grantham University 5 years ago. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, the diner half empty, when I walked over with a menu and a coffee pot and found myself looking at a man who did not belong in a vinyl booth on Route 9. His coat alone probably cost more than my monthly rent. He had an accent I recognized before I understood why I recognized it, and eyes that tracked me across the room like he was solving a puzzle he'd been working on for a very long time. "I'm sorry," he said, before I'd even set down the coffee. "Did you go to Grantham University around 5 years ago?" My stomach dropped straight through the floor of that diner. I set the coffee pot down harder than I meant to. "Who's asking?" He stood up slowly, like he wanted to make it clear he wasn't a threat, and he said a name I hadn't heard in 5 years, except it wasn't the name I remembered. "My name is Anders Christofferson. 5 years ago, I introduced myself to you as Henrik. I want to tell you I processed that calmly. I didn't. I sat down hard in the booth across from him, in the middle of my own shift, while my manager shot me a look I ignored completely, and I listened to a man tell me that the boy I'd known for one night had been lying about nearly everything, including his own name. Anders Christofferson was, it turned out, the heir apparent to Christofferson Maritime, a shipping conglomerate out of Bergen, Norway, with a family fortune that predated his country's oil wealth by 2 generations. He'd been in the United States that semester under a false name specifically because his family had spent his entire childhood being targeted by people who wanted access to that fortune, and at 20, tired of never knowing if anyone liked him or his bank account, he'd used a study abroad program and a borrowed identity to spend 1 semester being an anonymous college kid. He told me, sitting in that booth, that he'd left in a hurry that September morning because his program coordinator had called an emergency meeting about a visa issue, and that he'd fully intended to find me again within the week. Instead, the visa issue turned into an early flight home, a family health scare, and then 2 years of simply not knowing how to find a girl whose last name he'd never learned and whose dorm he could no longer place on a map he'd only half memorized. He told me he'd spent 2 years and, by his own estimate, a genuinely embarrassing amount of money trying to track me down, hiring people to search old Grantham enrollment records, university event photography, anything that might connect a face to a name. He found me, in the end, through a 5-year-old photo tagged at a campus food drive that a former classmate had never taken down from an old social media account. I told him about Mila. I watched a full-grown man, heir to a fortune I couldn't have imagined the size of, fall apart at a Formica table in the middle of a diner shift on a Tuesday afternoon. He put his face in his hands and didn't speak for almost a full minute. Within a week, on terms I insisted on controlling, Anders had a trust established for Mila that she couldn't touch until she was 25, structured so that neither he nor I could draw from it for anything but her direct benefit. He paid 5 years of backdated child support that by any fair accounting he'd never technically owed since he hadn't known she existed, but he insisted on it anyway, calling it a debt regardless of intent. He bought a house on Cattermole Street and put it entirely in my name. No strings, no shared ownership, because I'd made it clear from the first conversation that I would not build my daughter's stability on top of anyone else's leverage again. His mother, a soft-spoken woman named Ingrid, flew in from Bergen with within the month, sat on my new living room floor, and asked my 5-year-old daughter what her favorite color was like. It was the single most important piece of information in the world. For the first time in 5 years, I stopped doing math in my head every time I walked into a grocery store, and that, of course, is precisely when my father reappeared. He showed up on a Thursday evening with a bouquet of grocery store carnations, the cheap kind wrapped in cellophane, standing on my new porch in a cardigan I didn't recognize. His voice pitched into a softness I had never once heard him use on me while I actually needed it. "I've missed you every single day," he said, like the words had been sitting warm in his chest for 5 years. Instead of arriving the week a Norwegian shipping heir moved a Range Rover into my driveway. "Family forgives, Ava. Life's too short for this." He told me a neighbor had mentioned an unfamiliar car with foreign plates parked outside my house. That's what had brought him back to my door. Not me, a license plate. I let him in anyway, not because I believed a word coming out of his mouth, but because some part of me, the part still 18 and standing on that dark curb, wanted to watch exactly what he'd do next with my own eyes. He sat on my new couch that first night and talked about second chances for 45 minutes straight. He talked about tough love, about how hard it had been for him too, a widower raising 2 kids alone, about how young and foolish I'd been at 18, and how a wiser, gentler father might have handled things differently. "I think about that night more than you know," he said, turning his cardigan sleeve over in his fingers, not quite looking at me. "I think about it every year around your birthday. You could have called," I said. "Any of the 6 birthdays since. I didn't think you wanted to hear from me." He said it like it was a reasonable, even generous assumption, like the silence had been a courtesy extended in my direction, rather than a decision he'd made and never once revisited. "Pride's a strange thing, Ava. Mine kept me from picking up the phone. I imagine yours did the same to you." I let that sit, because arguing with it felt like it would take more energy than I had left in me that night, and because I wanted badly to see where the conversation would go if I simply let him talk. He never once used the word sorry. Not that first visit, not in any of the visits that followed over the next 3 weeks. Instead, he used words like circumstances and misunderstanding and water under the bridge, phrases engineered to describe an event without ever admitting he'd been the one who caused it. He talked about my mother, how she would have wanted us whole again, invoking her the way he'd once invoked her at the hospital, gripping her hand so tight the nurse had needed to pry his fingers loose, love expressed as possession rather than presence. "Your mother believed people could change," he said, standing to leave that first night, pausing in my doorway the way he'd once stood in the doorway of my childhood bedroom with a very different set of intentions. I'd like the chance to prove her right. I watched him walk to his car, and I stood in my own doorway for a long time afterward, turning that sentence over. I wanted to believe it. That was the most dangerous part of the entire month that followed. Not that my father was manipulating me, which I'd half expected from the moment the grocery store flowers appeared, but that some small, stubborn 18-year-old part of me still wanted so badly for even one word of it to be true. I let him keep visiting because I wanted to see the shape of what he actually wanted, and it didn't take long to find out. The visits escalated fast, each one pushing a little further than the last, each one dressed up as love. The second visit came 4 days later, and this time he didn't come alone. He brought Theo, who was 20 now, home for the summer from the state college my father was still paying for, and who shot me an apologetic look the moment he walked through my door, like he already knew he was being used as a prop and hated himself a little for showing up anyway. "Theo's missed having his sister at the table," my father said, settling into the same spot on my couch like he'd already claimed it as his. "Haven't you, son?" Theo mumbled something non-committal and wouldn't meet my eyes. Later in the driveway, while our father said his goodbyes to Mila on the porch, Theo grabbed my arm and whispered quick and low, "He asked me to come, told me it would mean a lot to you." I didn't know what to say, Ava. "I'm sorry. I should have called first." I told him it was fine, that I wasn't angry with him, and I meant it, but I filed the detail away anyway. Our father had recruited an audience before he'd even walked through my door. I understood, watching him, exactly what my father was doing. He wasn't rebuilding a relationship with me. He was drafting Theo as a witness, a warm body that made the whole performance look less like a man courting his own granddaughter's fortune and more like a family, tentatively, imperfectly, finding its way back to each other. It was effective. I felt the pull of it even knowing what it was. Theo was the one person who'd never once failed me, and watching him sit in my living room, nervous and hopeful, made it harder to keep my guard fully up. I let the visit happen. I told myself I was doing it for Theo, so he could have an afternoon that didn't involve sneaking around a park with $40 in his pocket. I told myself that wasn't the same as forgiving our father. I still believe that was true, but it was the first ceiling. My father had found the crack he needed, and it wasn't me. It was my brother's loneliness, and he pressed on it exactly the way he'd once pressed on Marcus's father at that Rotary dinner, quietly, using information he already had. The third visit, a week later, he came alone again, and this time the softness had a different texture to it. He sat at my kitchen table, turned his coffee cup slowly in a full circle, and told me, unprompted, that his cardiologist had found something on a recent scan. Nothing urgent, he said, nothing anyone needed to worry about yet. But he was 61 now, he reminded me, and men in our family didn't tend to live long past 70, and he didn't want to waste whatever years he had left being estranged from his only grandchild. "I'm not asking for anything, Ava," he said, which was, I'd come to learn, always the sentence he used directly before asking for something. "I just don't want to die a stranger to that little girl. Maybe you could bring her by the house sometime. Let her see where her mother grew up. I didn't answer that right away. The house on Brambleworth Lane, the circular driveway, the lawn service that came every Thursday, whether the grass needed it or not, all of it still sat in my memory as the place where a locksmith had changed the front door lock while I stood outside in the cold. I told him I'd think about it, which was, I realize now, the exact same non-committal sentence he'd once taught me to use whenever I wanted to end a conversation without giving him the satisfaction of a real answer. I told him I appreciated him telling me, and I meant it, in the narrow sense that I appreciated having more information about what he was doing. What I didn't say was that I recognized the maneuver instantly, because it was the same one he'd used on my mother in her final year, invoking mortality as a bargaining chip long before either of them needed to. Health, like money, like family, was just another lever to him, another column in the ledger he was always quietly balancing. I let it go because calling it out felt cruel in the moment, even knowing it was calculated. That was the second ceiling. He'd found that grief and mortality moved me, even when I didn't want them to, and he filed that information away the same efficient way he filed everything else. By the fourth visit, he'd met Mila properly for the first time, and I watched him work a 5-year-old with the same patient technique he'd once used on Rotary Club fathers and insurance clients twice his age. He brought her a stuffed reindeer, because I heard she likes Norway things, which was the first small alarm bell, quiet enough that I almost missed it, because I hadn't told him anything about Norway things. He sat on the floor of Mila's room, cross-legged, and asked her gentle, wandering questions, the kind that sound like idle curiosity if you're not listening carefully. "Does Mommy's friend come around a lot, sweetheart? The one who visits?" "Anders," Mila said, delighted to know an answer. "He brings pancakes. Does he stay for dinner too? Does he sleep over sometimes?" "Sometimes he stays real late playing Candyland." "Does he have a big car? One of those really big black ones?" Mila nodded, proud of herself, the way 5-year-olds are proud of any fact they're trusted enough to hold. "It has a TV in the back seat." I stood in the doorway with a laundry basket on my hip, listening to my father extract, one gentle question at a time, an entire informal asset assessment from a 5-year-old who thought she was simply being asked about her favorite person. He never once asked about her favorite cartoon. He never once asked if she liked her new preschool, or what games she played at recess, or whether she'd made friends. Every question orbited, patiently, persistently, back to Anders, back to money, back to the size of the car and the frequency of the visits, and Mila, innocent and unguarded, answered every single one. I stood in the doorway and told myself he was just a grandfather getting to know his granddaughter's world. I told myself that even as something cold moved through my stomach, watching how precisely his questions were aimed, how little interest he showed in Mila's favorite cartoons or her friends from preschool, how much interest he showed in cars and visitors and money, that was the third ceiling, and I let it break too because the alternative was admitting how far he'd already gotten inside my house. The fifth visit was the one that finally showed me his whole hand. He arrived on a Thursday evening in April, a full month after the flowers on my porch, and I noticed immediately that his eyes went first, before anything else, to the mantel above my fireplace. There was a framed photograph there, one Ingrid had sent 2 weeks earlier, of Mila sitting on the edge of a hotel suite bed in Bergen during her first visit to meet her Norwegian family, laughing, dressed in a tiny knitted sweater, surrounded by a level of quiet luxury that had nothing to do with anything my father had ever provided either of us. He crossed the room and picked up the frame with both hands, careful, the way you'd handle something you were already calculating the resale value of. For a moment, his face did something I hadn't seen it do since my mother's funeral, some genuine flicker of feeling, and I almost let myself hope it was tenderness. Then it passed, and something else moved in behind his eyes instead, hungrier, sharper, a man doing arithmetic. "Who exactly?" he asked, slow and low, still looking at the photograph instead of me. "Is her father?" He already knew. I could see it in the careful, deliberate way he said it, like he was tasting a word he'd already decided to make his. I opened my mouth to answer him, but before I could say a single word, the kitchen door swung open behind us. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. Anders had been standing right there the whole time, on the other side of that door, getting Mila a glass of water because she'd asked for one 3 minutes earlier and he'd volunteered, the way he always did. Small and steady and unremarkable, in a way my father had never once managed to be. He'd heard every word. I could tell from his face, which had gone very still, very careful, in a way I recognized because I'd worn that same expression myself for most of my childhood. My father set the photo frame down too quickly, the glass clacking hard against the mantel wood, and turned to find a shipping heir standing in my kitchen doorway holding a plastic cup of water, with a straw bent at a child-friendly angle, looking at him like he just watched a man's whole architecture collapse in real time. For a moment, nobody spoke. Mila, oblivious, called from the other room asking if her water was coming. Anders didn't move. My father's face did something complicated, some rapid recalculation happening behind his eyes, the same recalibration I imagined he did in board meetings when a deal went sideways in front of the wrong people. I watched him try, for one brief, almost pitiable second, to decide whether there was any version of the last 30 seconds he could talk his way backward out of. There wasn't. What happened next happened fast, and it happened because of Theo. My brother had been quiet quiet through the whole visit, sitting at the edge of the couch. But the moment he saw our father's face go slack in that doorway, something in him finally cracked loose. He stood up so fast his coffee nearly went over. "Ask him how he knew," Theo said. His voice was shaking, but he kept going. "Ava, ask him how he already knew Anders was rich before you ever told him." I turned to my brother, not understanding yet. Theo pulled his phone out of his pocket with hands that weren't quite steady. "I help him with the office book sometimes," he said. "Summer job, whatever, since I was 16. 3 weeks ago, I was reconciling the business card statement for him, and there was a $4,000 charge to a company called Halloran Verity Group. I looked it up because it didn't match any vendor we use. It's a corporate intelligence firm, Ava. People hire them to run backgrounds on business partners, sometimes on people they're thinking about suing." He swallowed. "I didn't think anything of it until the neighbor thing, the flowers, all of it happening right after. So I looked closer. There's an invoice line item. Subject, A. Christofferson, Bergen, Norway. Dated 3 weeks before you ever heard the name Anders out loud in this house." The room went very quiet. I thought about the stuffed reindeer, because I heard she likes Norway things. I thought about how he'd known, at the mantle, exactly which name to reach for, exactly which word, father, to weaponize before I'd said it myself. I thought about a 16-year-old version of me watching him do the exact same thing to a boy named Marcus, quietly, efficiently, calling it due diligence. There had never been a neighbor. There had never been a license plate. My father had known about Anders's fortune for 3 full weeks, before he ever bought a single cheap carnation, before he ever stood on my porch and said the word missed like it meant something. The grief, the health scare, the tender questions about my daughter's favorite color, all of it had been staged on top of a spreadsheet he'd already run the numbers on. He hadn't come back for a daughter. He'd come back for a client he'd identified as newly, spectacularly solvent. I looked at my father. He was still holding the frame's cracked corner where it had knocked against the mantle, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched him have absolutely nothing prepared to say. "That's not," he started, and then stopped, because even he seemed to hear how thin it sounded before it left his mouth. He tried again. "You're twisting a business expense into something ugly, Ava. I run background checks on people constantly. It's the nature of my industry." "On your own grandchild's father?" Anders said. It was the first thing he'd said since walking through that door, and his voice was quiet, almost gentle, which made it land harder than shouting would have. He set the water cup down on the counter with careful precision, the way a man sets down something he doesn't trust himself to be holding while he's angry. "Before you had met her, before you had said one true word to your daughter about wanting her back in your life. You don't know anything about this family," my father said, and something in his voice sharpened, the old flatness creeping back in, the same tone from the hallway 6 years earlier. "You're a stranger who walked into my daughter's life with a fake name and a foreign bank account. You don't get to stand in her kitchen and lecture me about honesty. I lied about my name for 1 semester when I was 20 because my family has spent generations being hunted by people exactly like you," Anders said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I spent 2 years and more money than I'm comfortable admitting trying to find a woman I wronged by disappearing on her so I could make it right. You spent $4,000 finding out how much she was suddenly worth and then bought carnations." My father's jaw worked. I watched him look around the room, from Theo to Anders to me, doing the same rapid calculation I imagined he ran every time a deal started slipping, searching for the angle that would let him walk out of this with something intact. "Ava," he said, turning fully to me now, and his voice dropped back into that practiced softness, the one from the porch. "Sweetheart, this is a misunderstanding. I've made mistakes, I'll own that, but everything I've done these past weeks has come from wanting to know my granddaughter. Are you really going to let one confused invoice undo weeks of real progress? Family forgives. I taught you that. You taught me that a locksmith can change a lock in under an hour," I said. "That's what you taught me, 6 years ago, before I'd even finished packing a bag. You didn't teach me forgiveness, Dad. You taught me arithmetic. And it turns out I learned it well enough to watch you do the same math on my daughter that you did on me." He flinched. It was small, barely visible, but I saw it because I'd spent 18 years learning to read every micro-expression that crossed that man's face for warning signs. For 1 second, something that might have been real shame passed through him. Then it was gone, replaced by something colder and more familiar, the look he wore when a client tried to dispute a claim he had no intention of paying out. "You're being dramatic," he said. "This is exactly the kind of instability that got you into trouble at 18. Reckless decisions, no thought for consequences. The only reckless decision in this room," Anders said, still quiet, still unshaken, "was hiring a firm to investigate a 5-year-old's father before you'd said a single kind word to her mother. I don't know what kind of man does that. I know I don't want him within 100 miles of my daughter." The word landed hard in the room. My daughter. Not Mila's biological father claiming territory. A man drawing a line around a child he'd known for 6 weeks, doing instinctively what my own father had never once managed to do in 18 years, choosing her without calculating what it cost him first. I stepped past both of them, into the doorway of the hall, close enough that Mila couldn't hear, but far enough that everyone in that room understood I was done letting this conversation happen around me instead of from me. "I need you to hear this clearly, because I'm only going to say it once," I said, and my voice didn't shake, which surprised me more than anything else that happened that night. "You didn't come back for me. You never once came back for me. Not when I was sleeping in a shelter 20 minutes from your driveway. Not when Theo was sneaking me $40 out of his own pocket pocket because he was scared of what you'd do if you found out. You came back because a neighbor's lie about a license plate turned out to be true in a way you could profit from. I spent 5 years grieving a father who I thought might come around eventually. I'm done grieving him. I'd rather have no father than one who does math before he does love. Ava, you have until 9, I said. I'd start now. I watched it land. I watched him understand in real time exactly which 2 hours I was handing back to him, wrapped in the same words he'd used on me, delivered with the same flat, quiet finality he'd taught me himself in that hallway 6 years ago, when I was 18 and terrified and completely alone. He left without another word. I heard his car pull out of my driveway too fast, tires chirping against the curb the way they never had when he was the one being patient. And then it was just the three of us standing in a kitchen that suddenly felt too quiet. Mila's forgotten water cup still sweating a ring onto the counter. Theo didn't go home that night. He sat at my kitchen table until almost midnight, running his hands through his hair, apologizing over and over for something that wasn't his fault. I should have said something sooner, he kept saying. The invoice, I saw it 3 weeks ago. I should have called you the second I saw it. You called me the second it mattered, I said. You didn't owe me 3 weeks ago. You've been sneaking me $40 at a park since you were 15, Theo. You've never owed me anything else on top of that. I let him use me tonight, bringing me along like I was supposed to be proof you two were fine. You didn't let him do anything. You didn't know that's what the visit was for until you were already in the room. And the second you understood it, you're the one who blew the whole thing open. I reached across the table and took his hand, the same hand that used to pass me folded $20 bills through a park bench 4 years ago. That's not being used, Theo. That's just what it looks like to grow up in that house and survive it by staying quiet until the day you don't have to anymore. He apologized a few more times that night anyway, for having grown up under the same roof and learning to survive it by staying quiet. I told him what I'd told myself for years. Quiet had kept him fed and in school. It wasn't a moral failure. It was a strategy, and strategies aren't the same as loyalty. He moved out of our father's house within the month, into a small apartment near campus that Anders quietly co-signed for, without ever mentioning it to me until the lease was already signed. And he stopped doing the office books the following week, which meant, among other things, that he no longer had access to whatever else our father might have been quietly investigating in the months ahead. It felt like watching someone finally step out of a current that had been pulling at him his whole life. The wider family split almost exactly the way I'd expected it to, which is to say, along the lines of who had something to gain by staying close to my father and who didn't. My Aunt Deborah, his sister, called me within a week, not out of concern, but out of what I can only describe as scouting. It's just so wonderful, all of it, she said, her voice pitched into a warmth I hadn't heard from her since I was a child too young yet to have become a liability. I always said you'd land on your feet, Ava. Your father's been under so much stress lately, you know, with the business. I don't suppose there's been any thought of, well, support for the wider family. We're all so proud of you. I told her politely that the trust was structured specifically so that it couldn't be touched by anyone but Mila herself, not me, not Anders, and certainly not extended relatives who hadn't sent so much as a birthday card in 6 years. There was a silence on the other end of the line, 3 full seconds of dead air before she found a reason to end the call. I never heard from her again after that. Not a text, not a holiday card, nothing, which told me everything about the actual size of her interest in her grandniece, and confirmed something I'd already begun to suspect, that my father wasn't an isolated case in that family, so much as he was simply the one who'd been caught. But not everyone reacted that way. My mother's older sister, Aunt Priscilla, who I hadn't spoken to in almost a decade because my father had spent years quietly discouraging contact between us, sent a card 2 weeks later. Inside, in handwriting that looked so much like my mother's it made my chest ache, she'd written that she'd watched my father do this exact thing to my mother's own inheritance 20 years earlier, calculating and managing and positioning himself, and that she'd always regretted not saying something sooner. She included her phone number and asked simply if I'd like to have coffee sometime. No agenda, just family. I cried reading it in a way I hadn't cried in the entire 6 years since that porch. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to relief, the strange, disorienting relief of learning that not everyone who shared my blood shared my father's arithmetic. Around that same time, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, and it turned out to be Patrice, the nurse who'd held my hand through the last hour of Mila's delivery 6 years earlier, back when I had no one else in that hospital room. She'd heard through a co-worker whose sister-in-law attended my father's old church, a garbled version of the story, one that had already mutated into something closer to gossip than fact, and she'd tracked down my number through the hospital's old patient files. Technically not something she was supposed to do, just to check on me. We talked for almost an hour. She told me she'd thought about me over the years more than she probably should have, that most nurses see hundreds of deliveries and forget the details within a month, but that mine had stuck with her, a scared 18-year-old with no one in the room. She said she was glad, genuinely glad, that I'd built something good out of a beginning that had looked so bare. Before we hung up, she asked if she could send Mila a small gift. Nothing extravagant, just something from a nurse who'd never quite stopped wondering how that first night turned out. A week later, a package arrived with a children's book about a lighthouse keeper's daughter, and a card that said, simply, I knew you'd figure it out. I keep that card in the same drawer as my mother's rosary now. 2 small proofs that kindness had shown up for me at both ends of this story, even when blood had. It struck me, hanging up the phone that night, night that the people who'd actually shown up for me across 6 years, Patrice, Theo, Aunt Priscilla, even a diner manager at Harlow's who'd once quietly covered a shift for me when Mila had a fever, had never once been the people whose last name I shared by blood. Family, I was starting to understand, was turning out to be a much smaller and much more deliberate word than I'd grown up believing it was. My father did not go quietly. 2 weeks after the confrontation in my kitchen, he showed up at Mila's preschool during pickup, telling the front desk he was there as her grandfather, producing a birth certificate copy he had no legal right to be carrying, trying to sign her out before I'd even finished my shift. I have every right to collect my own granddaughter, he told the director, according to the incident report I read 3 days later. This is a misunderstanding between adults. It has nothing to do with the child. The director, a woman named Ms. Okafor, whom I'd come to be endlessly grateful for, held her ground. Sir, if you're not on the approved pickup list, I legally cannot release her to you, misunderstanding or not. He argued for nearly 10 minutes before he left, according to that same report, a report I still have in a folder in my filing cabinet because I learned, finally and completely, that with my father, everything needed to be documented. I hired a family law attorney the following week, a woman named Renata Ochoa, whose first name struck me hard enough that I took it as a small, absurd sign that I was doing the right thing. She was blunt in a way I appreciated immediately, laying my file out on her desk during our first meeting and going through it line by line. Biologically, he's her grandfather, she said. Legally, right now, he's a stranger with no custody standing whatsoever, because you and Anders share sole authority over her, and neither of you has extended him any. Pennsylvania doesn't hand out grandparent visitation rights just because someone shows up wanting them, especially not to a man with a documented incident report from a preschool. She tapped the folder. This helps. Documentation always helps. Keep every card, every letter, every voicemail, no matter how harmless it sounds. People like your father rarely leave a smoking gun on the first try, but they get careless by the third or fourth. She helped me draft a formal cease and desist letter, sent through her office on firm letterhead, making clear that Walter Calder had no legal standing regarding Mila, and that any further attempt at unauthorized contact, at her school or otherwise, would be treated as harassment and pursued accordingly. We didn't need a restraining order, not yet, but we had the letter on file, dated, certified, ready to escalate if we ever did. Renata told me almost offhand, on my way out of that first meeting, that in 15 years of family law, she'd seen this exact pattern more times than she could count. Absent relatives circling back the moment money entered a child's life, and that the ones who reacted to a cease and desist letter with a lawsuit of their own, rather than simply going quiet, were revealing something important about how much they'd actually expected to get away with. He tried once more after that, a different angle this time. A letter arrived at Anders's family office in Bergen, forwarded eventually to us, in which my father, writing on Calder and Whitmore letterhead like it lent him some kind of legal weight, suggested that given the significant financial changes in the family, it might be appropriate to discuss grandparent visitation rights, and separately, in a paragraph that made even Anders's normally unshakable calm slip for a moment, a proposed consulting arrangement in which Calder and Whitmore might provide risk assessment services to the Christofferson family's American investments. Renata Ochoa read that letter out loud to me over the phone, and I remember laughing, one short, ugly laugh because it was so perfectly, completely him. Even at the end, even fully exposed, he couldn't resist trying to angle his way onto the payroll. Anders called me the morning his family's office forwarded him the letter, and I could hear, for the first time since I'd known him, something close to real anger under his usual steadiness. He wants to consult on our risk assessments, he said, and I could picture him pacing, the way he always paced when something genuinely rattled him. Ava, he found out I existed 3 weeks before he ever said your name out loud, and now he's applying for a job. That's who he is, I said. I told you that in my kitchen. You just hadn't seen the full range yet. I have a lawyer in Bergen drafting a response, he said. Not threatening, just precise. I want it on record, permanently, that Christofferson Maritime has no relationship with Walter Calder, financial or otherwise, and never will. I don't want him telling a single other person, ever again, that he has access to us. It was, I think, the closest Anders ever came to true fury in the entire 6 years I've known him. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, permanent closing of a door, executed with the same careful precision his family had probably used for generations to keep exactly this kind of man at a distance. Ingrid, Anders's mother, called me the day that letter arrived. Not angry, just quiet and thoughtful in the way she always was. She told me she was sorry, that she recognized the shape of what my father was doing because there had been men like him circling her own husband's family for 40 years, men who mistook proximity to money for a relationship. She told me that in her experience, the ones who came for money always eventually showed you exactly who they were, usually faster than you expected, and that at least now I knew for certain, instead of spending years wondering. I want to be honest about something else, because I think the honesty matters more than the neat ending. There was a night, about 6 weeks after the confrontation, when I drove out to Restwood Cemetery on the edge of Millbrook and sat on the grass in front of my mother's headstone for almost 2 hours, and I grieved something I hadn't let myself grieve in 6 years. I brought flowers, the good kind, not the cellophane-wrapped wrapped carnations my father had once used as a prop on my porch, but real ones, ranunculus, because I remembered her mentioning once, half laughing, that they were the flowers she'd have chosen for her own wedding if the budget had allowed it. I sat there with the stems going soft in my hands and told her, out loud, like she could hear me, everything that had happened since the last time I'd visited. The diner, Anders, the trust, the mantle, the invoice, all of it. The whole strange arc of the last 6 years compressed into one long, one-sided conversation with a headstone. Not my father's absence, exactly. I'd made my peace with that a long time ago. I grieved the father I'd never actually had. The one my mother used to promise me was in there somewhere underneath all that caution, patient, waiting for the right conditions to finally come out. Sitting on that grass, I understood, fully and finally, that the man my mother had described had probably never existed at all, that she'd been describing a hope she held for him rather than a man she'd actually witnessed. I cried for the version of him I'd spent my whole childhood waiting for, because grieving a person who was never real is somehow lonelier than grieving one who was. I sat there until the cemetery groundskeeper came by at dusk to tell me the gates were closing, and I drove home with my eyes swollen and my chest hollowed out, and the next morning I got up and made Mila's lunch and drove her to preschool and went on with my life, because that's what you do, even when a grief doesn't have a clean edge to it. My father's business took a quiet hit over the following months, not from anything I did, but from Millbrook being a small enough town that stories travel, especially stories with a shipping air and a cracked photo frame in them. Two of his longtime clients at Calder and Whitmore moved their policies elsewhere that summer. I heard secondhand, through Theo, that he'd started attending a different church across town, one where nobody yet knew the shape of what he was. I still work, if you're wondering, though not at Harlow's anymore. I finished my associate's degree 2 years ago, and now manage the front of house at a bistro downtown. A job I'm good at and proud of in a way that has nothing to do with anyone else's money. I didn't need to keep working. Anders made that clear more than once, gently, without ever pushing. But I'd built an identity out of the years when working was the only thing I had, and I wasn't willing to hand that identity over just because the math of my life had finally changed. I wanted Mila to grow up watching her mother clock in and do a job well, not simply watching her mother spend a fortune she hadn't earned. Mila is 6 now. She still doesn't fully understand why she has a grandfather she's never allowed to see, and I've made a decision, one I revisit constantly and haven't always been sure of, to tell her the truth in pieces as she grows, rather than a single story delivered all at once. Right now, what she knows is simple. Some people love you like a math problem, and some people love you like a person, and it's always allowed to choose the second kind, even when the math problem shares your last name. I still live in the house on Cattermole Street, though it doesn't feel like a gift anymore, so much as it feels like mine, in the way that things become yours once you've filled them with your own ordinary life. Birthday cake crumbs pressed into the kitchen tile, a growth chart penciled onto the pantry doorframe, Mila's drawings taped crooked across the refrigerator. Anders comes twice a month, sometimes more, not as a romantic partner. That ship, we both agreed early on, had sailed the same September night it began, but as exactly what he set out to be once he found me again. Steady, present, unremarkable in the best possible way. He makes pancakes shaped badly like animals every visit and lets Mila win at every board game with an obviousness that makes her shriek with laughter, certain of her own genius. Ingrid calls every Sunday. Theo graduated last spring with a degree in accounting, no thanks to a tuition he no longer needed to fear losing, and he works now for a small firm 2 towns over, one with no connection at all to Calder and Whitmore. He comes for dinner most Thursdays. Sometimes watching him laugh at something Mila's said, unguarded in a way I never once saw him as a teenager, I think he got the better end of this whole story, even though he lost the same father I did, because he got to stop being afraid of losing something years earlier than I did. I have coffee with Aunt Priscilla once a month now. She tells me stories about my mother that I never knew, small ones, the kind that don't make it into eulogies. The way Renata used to sneak extra sugar into her coffee when my father wasn't looking, the way she'd wanted once, before marriage rearranged her priorities, to open a flower shop. I think about that sometimes. The flowers on the kitchen table she always kept fresh, even on tight budgets, and I wonder if some small defiant part of her had been keeping that dream alive, one grocery store bouquet at a time, right under the nose of a man who'd eventually try the same cheap flowers on me as a manipulation tactic instead of a tribute. My father tried one more time last winter, a card that arrived at the house with no return address, containing a single line, "I think about you both often." I didn't respond. I don't say that with any triumph in my chest. I say it because I've learned that not responding is sometimes the clearest sentence you can send someone, and because I no longer owe him the labor of crafting a reply to a man who has never once, in 6 years, managed to write the word sorry without also writing an invoice somewhere underneath it. Here's what I've come to understand, sitting with all of this, turning it over the way you turn over a stone that used to sit in your shoe. My father spent my entire childhood teaching me that love was conditional, that it had to be earned through the right grades and the right pew and the right, tidy, presentable life. I spent 5 years after he threw me out believing that lesson had broken something in me permanently, that I'd go through life always waiting for someone to hand me a deadline and a locksmith. What actually happened is that the years taught me the opposite lesson instead, slowly, expensively, one double shift and one kind nurse and one loyal brother at a time. Love that has to calculate its return on investment before it shows up was never love in the first place. It was accounting wearing love's clothes. My father is, and I suspect will always be, an excellent accountant. He built a granddaughter into a line item the moment he learned her true value, and he never once, in all his careful visits and soft porch voices, managed to make that column disappear from view. I don't know if I'll ever fully stop grieving the father I didn't get. Some nights, watching Mila fall asleep against Anders's shoulder during a movie, or listening to Theo tell a story at my kitchen table with none of the old fear behind his eyes, I feel the absence anyway. A small cold seat at a table that should have had one more warm person in it. That's the part I don't think you ever get to skip, no matter how good your life becomes afterward. Something real was lost on that porch 6 years ago. A father who, if my mother was ever right about him, existed somewhere underneath all that caution and simply chose, every single day since, not to come out. He wanted to be grandfather of the year the moment he found out what my daughter was worth. I hope, wherever he is now, turning over whatever new column he's found to balance, that he understands he already had the only inheritance that ever mattered, freely offered, years before he ever thought to go looking for it. He just never once thought to check its value before he threw it away.